All right, here we are for the lesson on extremism. When I'm recording this lecture, it's the last lesson in the semester, so I might use this in a different order in the future. So if there are comments about it being in the end of the semester, that's why. So, extremism. Up to this point, we've covered some moral philosophy. In moral philosophy, we talked about moral standing. So each of these different moral theories have a way of understanding moral personhood and who does and doesn't count. As a full member of the moral community, such that we have obligations to them, we have to worry about them morally speaking. We've covered social contract theory in basic political philosophy. We've covered totalitarianism. We've covered dehumanism in this last part of the class. So again, having to do with totalitarianism and, eliminating moral standing from people. That's basically what dehumanization is. And we've talked about propaganda, and now we're going to end with extremism. So earlier in the semester, we covered epistemic or intellectual vices. We also covered conspiracy theories, and some of the information that I used to present during those lessons came from the same thinker that Qassam that we're going to use, that you've watched watched his lecture video or read a portion of his book on extremism for the class for this lesson, and his ideas about epistemic vices and conspiracy theories have a role to play in his understanding of extremism as well. And so those things are going to tie in here with us as well at the end. So if you remember way back in the earlier part of the semester, Qassam held the obstructionist view of epistemic vices. We also looked at the motivationalist view, but his view is that it's about the consequences of these dispositions that are personal character traits of ours that we are either are or aren't, that we're responsible for, and so he does think that we're responsible for our attitudes. But what's important about epistemic vices is that irregardless of our motivations as agents, these dispositions get in the way of knowledge. So that's why he called it the obstructionist view. Right? He also had a propaganda view of conspiracy theories. Remember, the minimalist definition was neutral. It was just, you got two or more people working together in secret, using at least partially secret means to pursue an objective that many people might not like. And that's a pretty neutral definition. It doesn't automatically dismiss conspiracy theories or anything like that, which was one of the points of that debate, is that conspiracy theory, just as a term, could be used as a term of abuse or as a silencing move, and that might prevent us from taking some things seriously that maybe we really should consider, because after all, some conspiracy theories do turn out to be true. But nevertheless, Qassam's definition was a propaganda definition of conspiracy theory, and so it had these 6 different features to it that we've discussed earlier in this semester. And of course, he says that conspiracy theories with these features are unlikely by design. So what he means by unlikely by design, they're unlikely to be true by design, because they're basically built out of propaganda and fallacious reasoning, right? So now we're going to turn to extremism. Many different political movements are labeled as extremist. There are all sorts of extremists in the world today, all running around the internet, different kinds of internet ideologies, not just on the internet, but in the real world as well. So we might ask, and this is the question in the lecture video that you watched, and then the reading, is whether extremism is just a term of abuse or not. So again, we've considered whether a conspiracy theory could be a term of abuse. People wonder about the term fascism or Nazi in the same way. Have they been emptied? Are they used so much that they are just emptied of any real meaning or content? They don't help us pick out anything distinctive or not. Well, Qassam's going to argue that it is a useful conceptual term. And so as a starting point, let's look at Berger's definition of extremism here. So he says extremism refers to the belief that an in-group success can never be separated from the need for hostile action against the outgroup. And so we've already studied propaganda and dehumanization a little bit, and one of the chief aims of propaganda, as we learned, is to create a division between us and them. And so you see that kind of idea playing a role here in this definition of extremism. Hostile acts can range from verbal attacks to diminishment, to discriminatory behavior, violence, and even genocide. This is obviously a very wide spectrum. And so, again, his key idea is that it's us. Extremism involves an us versus them way of thinking, and where our success depends on their eradication or us defeating them in some way, if not outright, genocide and elimination. So you've got an in-group, out-group dynamic where the in-group is prioritized and the out-group is dehumanized, right? So it restricts diversity and emphasizes social very rigid social identities. Extremism is then compatible with all sorts of views across the right-left side of the political spectrum, across the whole thing, right? And it could involve state or non-state actors. So, like, obviously, terrorist organizations, there's non-state actors. ISIS, at a point, was, or Al-Qaeda was a non-state actor, for example, right? And then there's state-sponsored terrorism as well, right? So it could, or extremism as well. So it could be, either state-backed or a non-state organization or individual. So let's turn to Qassam now. And again, he takes up the question of whether it's merely a term of abuse or whether it helps us pick out something distinctive conceptually. I'm not going to go through everything, right, that he went through. It's all important. I'm just going to pick out a couple of things to remind us about here. So, extremism, what is it? We've done this several times over the semester, where part of philosophical thinking is first just trying to gain some conceptual clarity over the concept, right? So we may have a lexical or vague definition, then we try to pin that down, right? We've seen that with many ideas over the semester, including, just what is knowledge or what is justice, those sorts of things. And here we're doing the same thing with extremism. So you can imagine Socrates having a dialogue with somebody over about with some interlocutor about the nature of extremism, trying to figure out a good example or a good way to conceive of that, right? So Qassam identifies three basic elements to extremism. It's got an ideological component, a methods or a means component, and then a psychological component to it. So it's about the ideas, right? Then it's about the means or the methods that are used, and then it's about the way in which these ideas are held as well. And then, of course, one of the more interesting topics he goes through is, whether extremism is necessarily bad or not. So we could wonder, for example, were the women suffragettes that were disrupting society, trying to get equal votes and equal representation in the political system, would that count as extremism? And if so, doesn't that show that maybe some forms of extremism are not so bad, right? Or so it raises a question about whether extremism is necessarily bad. Right. So types of extremism. Let's flesh out this a little bit. Let's do methods extremism first. It's probably the most obvious to many of us. People that engage in actions, right, or behaviors that fall well outside not just the statistical norm, but what we would typically consider appropriate normative behavior, right? Not just about what people do, but about what they ought to do, and limiting that as well. So violence is, the obvious example of an extreme subcategory there. But you could do things with, like, say, computer programs or sabotage, right? Not physical violence against another person that might be considered extreme. Most of you would probably think that that's pretty wild of me to go, like, blow up a power grid substation or something like that because I'm mad at, my local electric company or something like that, right? So then we have ideological extremism. This has to do more with the ideas and the positions or policies that we're worried about. So ideological extremism is a position in the ideological space, in Nozick's words, referring to Robert Nozick there. It falls somewhere near the end or fringe of something close to the normal distribution along the salient dimension. So you can think of the right-left spectrum there and think of the extremes in the sense that, I might, maybe I'm a radical right-winger and think that the government ought to impose my religion on people, no matter whether they believe it or not. Or maybe I'm like a radical left-winger and I think we got to have redistributive economic policies. But neither of us is, blowing up stuff to try to get our way. We're just out in the public sphere talking with people, trying to persuade them to these ideas, right? That would be different than pursuing extremist means to implement those ideas by force, right, or coup. And then we have the psychological dimension to this, which has several different components to it. So I'll just lay them all out here. I think I got all of them from the both the lecture and his book. here. So we've got necessity of unconventional and extreme measures. So the idea that these unusual or radical or extreme methods or actions have to be taken. The use of tactics to absolve us from responsibility for those bad consequences of those actions. We use military war metaphors to describe non-military actions. So, everything is a war on something, right? The ability of a group to achieve its rightful position is obstructed. So if I have an extremist mindset, I'm going to perceive that there are enemies stopping me from doing what I want, which is usually conceived of as righteous in some way, right? So then we have the glorifying of the past in reference to one's group. So oftentimes it's, trying to renew this alleged golden age, right? Or if we're looking forward, utopia, right? So that's both of those play a role here, both glorifying the past, some idyllic past that we need to recover, or some future that we could bring about that would be more perfect or a utopia. And then he includes catastrophizing and the perception that calamities will occur if we don't act and take these radical means. So again, part of the extremist mindset, the psychology of a person who is attracted to these not only radical ideas but also radical methods, right? There's often this element of the expectation that there will be some kind of supernatural intervention involved. God will help His warriors in some way, right? Or persecute the enemies, or to help you achieve success. There's the idea that we have some kind of imperative to purify the world of this evil. So ideas of purity and impurity usually play a pretty big role in extremist mindset as well. We have the glorification of dying for the cause or making oneself a martyr. We have the idea that we're somehow obligated to kill or make offensive war, so not just self-defensive actions, but to instigate against others. There's an any means necessary, so that's what he means here by true believers are entitled to use immoral means to ensure success. So we got to achieve our goal by any means necessary, no moral limits on what we can do to achieve it. We get along with that, we get the elevation of intolerance and vengeance and warlikeness as virtues instead of vices in the psychological extremist mindset. There's also, as we've already talked about, dehumanization of the other. And so depriving them of moral status, however that happens to be understood, so that we don't have obligations to them. We do what we want to them, right? So dehumanization is a way of getting people to the point where they are willing to do bad things to people who probably are deserving of moral consideration. And then we have the idea that the modern world is somehow deeply flawed in some way, and that civil government is illegitimate, so they have to be overturned, right? So there's often, again, utopianizing the past or the future. The modern world's bad, so we got to rid it of whatever element is secularism or whatever the impurity is that has to be eliminated, right? So again, several elements to an extremist mindset that he goes through there. And then here's where, epistemic vices and conspiracy theories have a role to play. So the particular ways of thinking that are associated with an extremist mindset are conspiracy thinking, apocalyptic thinking, and catastrophic thinking, sometimes called catastrophizing. So, everything, one little thing is really just this huge bad thing all the time for these sorts of, for this sort of mentality. So you end up with conspiracism, a monological belief system in which each belief serves as evidence for each other of the other beliefs. The more conspiracies a monological thinker believes in, the more likely he or she is to believe in any new conspiracy which may be proposed. There's actually some evidence on that. He's not making that up, that if you believe one conspiracy theory, you're more likely to not just believe one, but to believe many. So go back to our notion of thinking. That was relevant not only at the very beginning of the semester, internal-external dialogue, even if you're alone thinking from the perspective of others, right? That internal-external dialogue that Arendt talked about as a anecdote to propaganda and thoughtlessness and the banality of evil seems to be a part of monological thinking here, right? So again, philosophy looks like it can serve as an anecdote to some of this because it encourages critical thinking and gathering information and looking at things from alternative perspectives, which is the exact opposite of closed-mindedness, which is we've covered as an epistemic vice or an intellectual vice. So the closed-mindedness and dogmatism that characterize the extremist mindset both get in the way of knowledge and merit criticism. So again, the closed-mindedness, the unwilling to even listen to the other side, right? To hear what their ideas are. Things are so poisoned you won't even acknowledge that they might have a point at all, or are unwilling to consider the fact that they might have a point. So that gets in the way of that's gonna reinforce extremism. It's not gonna get in the way of extremism, right? So he says the various thinking patterns that are part and parcel of the extremist mindset are no less problematic, epistemically problematic. Conspiracy thinking, or what psychologists refer to as the conspiracy mentality, leads extremists to endorse fallacious or contradictory conspiracy theories. Well, that's why philosophy is important. It helps us pick those things out, right? It helps us recognize them. So there's not a lot of conspiracy theorists, that believe the world is run by lizard people who are over here concerned about making sure their arguments don't have any fallacies or errors of fact, or don't contradict other theories that we might believe. But in conspiracy mind, you don't really care about truth and reasoning. You're just like fitting things into a narrative that kind of, feeds into your security and the way you want the world to be. So catastrophic thinking is an obstacle to knowledge of one's actual situation or prospects, and the apocalyptic thinking, which leads groups like ISIS to find so irresistible, further weakens their grip on reality. So, it leads them to do these radical things like burn people in cages. It is also arguable that we're responsible for those attitudes. So that's, again, Qassam putting the emphasis back on the agent's responsibility, not in the social world that they live in. Echo chambers, obviously, are going to help breed extremism. They isolate their members from other sources of information. So you get a very strong us versus them, and they're not trustworthy, and everybody in here is trustworthy based on, membership of accepting a control belief or a set of control beliefs. So those are the people we're willing to listen to. Everybody else has got to go, right? So clearly, echo chambers can play a role in extremism as well. So given what we've learned about extremism from Qassam, his three elements to it, see if you can pick out some things that might count as extremist on his definition, right? Get some practice thinking through that particular view of what extremism is. And then out of that lecture, I hope you enjoyed the part where he talks about whether it's good or bad or not. Again, you can talk about whether the women suffragists are, were they extremists, and if so, does that make them bad, right? So again, whether extremism is always good or bad is going to depend on, what kind of extreme it is and the circumstances in which in which extremism exists. It doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? And so, we're probably at the end of the semester here. Again, I'm recording this lecture as the last last thing we're doing is on extremism. And so as a way of wrapping up the semester, we've talked about a number of abstract problems in philosophy. Do we live in a computer simulation? What is consciousness? Are there any absolute or universal moral truths? Or is everything a relative? Excuse me. So some philosophical issues are very abstract, but as I hope you've seen here, particularly in the last part of the class, if not really all through the class, philosophy can serve as an anecdote to some of those things that breed conspiracy thinking, getting trapped in echo chambers, being propagandized, being indoctrinated, because of the way it encourages critical thinking and learning, not just thinking about yourself, but learning from other perspectives so that you can gain an informed opinion and a well-reasoned view, so that we're really trying to base what we believe not just because it makes us feel good, but because there's good reasons to do it, right, and good reasons to believe it. And so by studying fallacious reasoning, propaganda, debates over conspiracy theories, and when it's rational to believe a conspiracy theory, when it's not, being on the lookout for, trying to avoid epistemic vices in ourselves, performing that epistemic reboot every once in a while to try and think through our beliefs, so we don't get caught in echo chambers, so that we're not getting, surreptitiously or covertly persuaded or indoctrinated to dehumanize others or becoming totalitarian subjects. Philosophy can help us pick out those dangers in the world. And certainly there are many of them in the world we live in. So I hope you've gotten some life lessons, some stuff out of class beyond just a quiz grade or a grade for your college degree. I hope you've learned some stuff that will help you in life. All right. So with that, y'all have a good one, and good luck on the final exam.